Okay, now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, David G. Lewis, PhD, a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, is a recognized researcher, scholar, writer, and assistant professor of anthropology and Indigenous studies at Oregon State University. For more than 20 years, Dr. Lewis has been passionate about studying the original histories of people of Oregon and California, and has an extensive record of collaborative projects with regional scholars, tribes, local governments, and communities. Lewis's research specializes in the history of Calapooians and other Western Oregon tribes, which he explores through journal essays and on his blog, the Cortux Journal. His latest book came out last fall and is titled Tribal Histories of the Willamette Valley. Welcome, Dr. Lewis.
Thanks, Dave. Let me get this set up here. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. I guess that
Have you be part of what I'm.
okay, so make sure everybody is muted except for me. Please. Thank you. We're going to save our questions at the end. I think our facilitators here will be looking at the chat. If you can, like preserve your questions in the chat, we can actually go through them pretty easily, and then there'll be an opportunity for people to put their hands up as well and ask the questions that they want to after that as well. So, but that's all going to be wait to the end, so I don't get a lot of interruptions. I have a lot of things to get through here, and always not enough time. So, thanks for coming to this event and being interested in my book. The book was at least 10 years in coming. I started with various different ideas in the beginning, and it sort of modified and morphed as we went forward. And a lot was helped by the whole about working with the Ooligan Press. They gave me some ideas about how to make it better, including adding personal perspectives in there, and so we'll talk about that in a minute. But really, my whole reason for doing this project is to really address some sort of problems we have in history. Generally, it's that most of us have never sort of really seen Native studies or Indigenous history addressed in schools, and it's not really been a big thing in our sort of grade school system. And I think in Oregon we're trying to address that now with having curriculum written. But in my own experience in Oregon, I mean, I didn't really get much information about my tribes or tribes in Oregon in our education system. So people generally just don't know anything about the tribes, and it's a huge problem because as tribal organizations and tribes sort of recapturing their original context, their land, sometimes their rights, their sovereignty. A lot of folks are asking, us, like, why is that? Why should they? Because, they just don't really understand the depth of colonization and what it did to us. So the book is really kind of an answer to that, trying to sort of address this issue, trying to bring more clarity to the process of colonization of the tribes, and looking how they changed from the perspective of Native peoples as much as possible. So some nuts and bolts here. Here's kind of the chapter outline I have in the book. The tribes I address mainly are Calapooia, Molalla, Clackamas, and their neighbors. Sometimes I can't really couldn't really limit the book to only the Calapooia people or only the Willamette Valley, because the larger sort of context of Native studies, Indigenous studies, suggests that things that happen in one part of the state actually affect the other part of the state. You know, things like the Roverine Wars in Southern Oregon absolutely affected why the tribes are being moved on to reservations all throughout Oregon. And so that all has to be told. So the book pretty much concentrates on the colonization era or settlement era and continued colonization efforts by the United States and Americans as the tribes being placed onto the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation, and then follows the tribes somewhat into the present era. Not completely, but somewhat. I really kind of concentrate more on that early 20th or 19th century period up to the early 20th century for much of the book. So let me just move forward here. Why I wrote this? Well, I really want to tell the stories from a Native perspective because, you know, if you read histories about Native peoples, the majority of histories written about us are not written from a Native perspective, and a lot of times Native people didn't even consult on the writings, and so a lot of times what you're getting is a completely non-Native perspective on our history. And you know, if you look at for examples of that, you know, there's plenty on Google Books you can download. There's probably hundreds of histories you can download Google Books and throughout the the internet. You know, a lot of times we are maybe the first paragraph, the first page, sometimes a chapter, but generally we're most of our history is ignored. The authors will say that we were moved to reservations, had treaties perhaps, and then we basically disappear from history. And the rest of the history is about non-Native people and what they built in Oregon. So that's I saw as a problem, and it's a problem for a lot of people, you know, not just Native people, but Blacks and Latinos and you know, many people of different cultures went through the same situation in Oregon or a similar situation in Oregon, and their history is also similarly not told, including women. A lot of times women's histories are not told at all because women were not considered to have a worthwhile history for whatever reason. And so most of our histories are written by non-Native white men. So that's a significant problem. So it's the last 30 or 40 years we've seen changes in that. We've seen lots of histories being written from 1970s on, sometimes with Native people as part of that project, sometimes not. And so I'm trying to, as much as possible, tell this just from a Native perspective, talk about how the tribes were changed and modified, what they had to go through as part of history. I'm not necessarily trying to rewrite all the other histories because there's plenty of books out there about that. You can get that from like I would suggest a library of books out there. So mine at some level is kind of a unicorn book. There's not many like it yet in this area. So other areas of the United States have other histories that are rewritten by Native peoples, but there's not a lot like this one. So as part of this whole thing, I offer personal encounters with my history, like what does it mean for a Native person who is relearning their history for the first time to suddenly realize that a certain place in Oregon is their origin place of your people. Something you didn't know for all your life until you're like 40, 45 years old. What does that mean? And how surprised are you? And so a lot of times that is what I'm doing. I'm figuring things out for the first time. Parts of Oregon that I relate to, my people relate to for the first time. And realizing how much was taken away from us by just realizing it now. And I'm also trying to be very accurate. Many histories in the past have kind of glossed over the fine details, the nuances of history, sometimes getting dates wrong and context wrong. And so I've tried to fix that much of that as possible in my book for as much as it is. It's very densely written. So some people have said that it's hard understanding all the details in the book. And I understand because I have to sort of learn all that and memorize all that stuff myself. So I know how dense and how much detail there is in this work. So let me just continue here. So here's a personal encounter that I decided to tell people. I didn't realize that our lifestyle was a result of our family being native, but there was no inherited wealth in the family at all. We had held on desperately to a small 1 quarter acre piece of property, acquired the GI Bill because we had nothing else. The irony is that our property in Salem is within the original Santiam Kalapuya territory, one of the tribes I'm descended from. Yet we struggled to maintain normal life only a few generations after our lands were taken away. Our people have lived in Oregon for more than 10,000 years and live well off the land, yet in a short period of time in the 1850s, we lost all our rights and future wealth for generations to come. At some level, we continue to relive that loss with each new generation. So that's a kind of a stark understanding, realizing, in recent studies that what I'm looking at is the continuous disenfranchisement of my people, my tribe, and that the federal government was implicit in continuing that disenfranchisement every generation into the present day. So one question I like to talk about is the decline of tribes. Our tribes were in decline in the mid 19th century. One of the reasons is a lot of folks like to say war. That's not really necessarily the reason. And here's my quote. The malaria epidemics caused the greatest change in tribal cultures. Tribal life was changed and many tribes collapsed. Previously powerful tribes disappeared. New confederations rose, and the immigrants from the neighboring tribes of the United States filled in empty spaces. Still, the remaining powerful tribes maintain their claims to their traditional territories, and these are reflected in the treaties 1850s. Early American settlers recorded the decline through letters and journals, and anthropologists recorded the vastly changed tribal cultures that were quickly disappearing, and further declines on the reservation due to settler-borne stresses. So it's really difficult sometimes finding information, but we know that the epidemiology of the valley is very bad. That we lost probably 90% of our people in under malaria. So that had to cause huge changes to all the tribes. War was less a factor in this valley than other places, maybe other than the Rogue River Valley or even on the Columbia, but there was conflict. I'm not saying there wasn't conflict. There was not like full-on wars in this valley. So, and recently I've really kind of focused on some of the environmental histories of the valley, because I'm finding that as I get to sort of the end of ethnographic records, and I'm kind of pretty close to that end where I've looked at just about everything there is. There's still stuff to be picked up out of that and to read again and to re-understand things, but there's other layers of information too. You can actually go to our environments, our territories that were originally tribal territories, and look at how how perhaps the environment modified the culture of the tribes, and what did the tribes have to adjust to in our environments. And so I'll talk about more about this in the latter part of the presentation, but I have a little quote here, some quotes here. Settlement of the Oregon Territory changed the environment for Native peoples. As the valley floor was changed and native plants eliminated, starvation among the Kalapuyans who depend on the annual harvest of these plants for the regular seasonal rounds was significant. When settlers arrived in the region, they were encroaching and claiming tribal lands as their own. They hunted out the game, plowed and fenced the prairies. These are and were primary resource lands where the tribes dug roots, gathered wild grains and berries, and hunted. The settlers' farming, ranching, and fencing the land caused changes that made life hard for the tribes. Plowing fields destroyed natural food plants like camas and yampa, and livestock like hogs rooted out tubers and roots, while cattle caused erosion. So you see, I'm starting to get into not just what the valley was like, but what kind of factors began changing it in settlement. And this gives us clues as to how it's not just the people that were colonized, the culture colonized, but the land itself was completely colonized. And we'll talk again about that more in a few minutes. So there's a really interesting situation that developed as people signed treaties and basically decided to move, sell their land. They really decided that, realizing that if they didn't, they would be basically sandpapered away to nothing, and they would be either have gone extinct, or there would be no lot more people. So so when it actually became time to move after the treaty was ratified, a lot of folks were not really wanting to actually move. So the government had to sort of make promises, and those promises in the field didn't always get carried forward. I wrote here, many Native people stated they did not get what they were promised. The many stories of broken promises of the federal government to the tribes are always related to what the tribes were promised to induce them to move to the reservation. The treaties included promises of food, housing, and services. But the final year, when Indians were trying to get the tribes to physically removed, the Indians made additional verbal promises. Many of these promises were not documented in the treaties, but were stated during meetings of the tribes. These promises became part of the oral history record of the tribes and are passed through tribal descendants to the present. I really saw this. We saw this happening with the formation of Grand Ronde. Many tribes, like the Molalla and Tillamook, refused to move until they were told they had to, kind of forced at gunpoint to move. But in the midst of the whole thing, like the Molalla have a story about how they were promised additional money and good housing and food to move. The problem is, when the Indian agents, either quit or lost their jobs, those promises went away. They're not written down. They're not ratified by the federal government. And so all the promises went away. And so tribes are not really happy about that. They were promised a lot of things. And in tribal society, when a chief or a leader makes a promise, they really try to honor that. Whereas in American society, that doesn't happen. When somebody loses their job, they're no longer, beholden to that or responsible for that promise. So there's several occasions in my work that I found, where chiefs were critical of the federal government because they're saying that, we're actually more powerful as chiefs than you guys are in your government, because you can be replaced at any time by being elected out of office or being fired, whereas we can't be. We're chiefs for life, which was really interesting context. And then I go into describing the conditions on the reservation quite a bit, mainly because most sources that I've seen, most history books, don't talk about conditions on the reservation at all. On the Grand Ronde Reservation for some 20 years, the tribes were not given land to farm, food, or adequate services like healthcare. Many people died in the first few years, never seeing promises fulfilled. When natives first came to the reservation, they were all relieved of their weapons, and so they could not hunt. Many of them were unfamiliar with this northern territory, did not know where the wild foods grew, like camas, berries, or where the good fishing rivers were. The tribes had to instantly change their diets from wild foods that they caught, hunted, gathered, or dug to beef, pork, flour, oil, and some vegetables. These are foods that the Indian people had little experience with. The tribes are completely at the mercy of the federal agents and the environment, and the sudden cumulative changes of 1856 contributed to malnutrition and sicknesses. So it's not just radically changing their environment and their food sources, it's also they had come directly out of a war or several wars in the South and in the North, and many of these people were very war torn. They were basically stressed out people, that they had lost their families. The war the Americans waged against the tribes in the South, especially in Rogue River area, was not only against the men, the warriors, it was against the women and children too. So whole families sometimes went extinct because there was this attitude among the militia to genocide at times. And so there was quite a bit of trauma in the tribes that had to contribute to the overall stress and well-being at the reservation. I wouldn't understand why that wouldn't have affected people at all. So when tribes people realized that the conditions at the reservation were not that great, they were not getting the food they wanted, the housing, the services they were promised. They actually didn't get land for 20 years. I mean, they didn't get what they were promised in the actual treaties that were ratified. Many of them decided to look for ways of making money so they can get their own food and own services off reservations. So they began this new culture of what we call nowadays indigenous migrant farm labor, where they began moving into the valley in the summertime for several weeks or several months sometimes, harvesting vegetables from farmers, and then whatever money they made, they would bring it back to the reservation. They could buy their own supplies in the winter times. So due to lack of resources and opportunities to make money and the lack of land to grow their own foods, many Native people began getting passes for their families to travel the Willamette Valley and pick crops from settler farms. This began traditional Native peoples from several reservations. Siletz, Grand Ronde, Klamath, Warm Springs have been the indigenous migrant farm laborers for generations of farmers in the Willamette Valley. Grand Ronde peoples would pick hops, beans, berries, black walnuts, and other crops growing near Independence, Wheatland Ferry, and around the Salem area. In this manner, money could be made through the summers while their small acres of crops, normally oats, wheat, and hay, were maturing on the reservation. The land at Grand Ronde is not that great, so when they were given a little bit of land, I think it was initially 100 acres. It did not make sustained food, so they'd have to only grow hay or maybe oats or something on it. And that was a big problem. Later on, they got a little bit more land, 260 acres under the Dawes Act. But even that was not enough to continuously make money off of or actually make food off of. So it was a huge problem. While the government was pushing them towards being farmers, they were not giving them all the tools to actually make it as farmers. So I go into this issue of unequal treatment and loss of wealth numerous times. Here's the quote I have here. The chiefs of the reservation pushed back against Bruneau's words. He was a missionary, citing that they had been taught to drink by whites, and everyone seemed to be drinking and gambling anyway, so why stop? They wanted equal treatment. They explained how poor everything was on the reservation, that they had no resources, and the promises of land sales and treaty making had not worked. They were still poor while the whites got rich. They revealed that the white Indian agents were not following the laws, and the United States was not appropriately following their agreements and the treaties of giving allotments and funding for needs at the reservation. So this was a constant problem. There was constantly letters from Indian agents saying, they didn't have enough resources, need to give them more money, more resources, and it didn't really come forward by the federal government at all. So continuing punishment, continues into the 1870s, where Chief Lewis Neposank and other chiefs of the reservation signed a petition sent to President Ulysses S. Grant. I have now been on this reservation 16 years. During that time, I have seen poor white men come here as officers of and stay a few years and go away rich, while I and all my people have always been growing poorer. We at first had a great deal of money. We come here in agreement with the terms of our treaty, but my people have never got much benefit from that money. Our superintendents and agents have got all of it, while I have seen people die for want of food, just as our horses die in the winter when they have nothing to eat. The men you have sent here for our officers have not only stolen our food, our money, but have violated our women and scattered disease among us, which have reduced our numbers from thousands to hundreds. So the initial population of the reservation, when they first moved there, was about 1,200 people. By 1900, there was only 400 left at the reservation. Some of those people had died and maybe not had children. Some of those people had just left because it was a horrible place to live. So some people decided to leave, and there's records of people stop identifying as Native people, Native Americans. If they stopped identifying as that, they would actually make twice the wage as if they were identified as Native. So that was a big inducement to actually leave the reservation. So much of my project is sort of rewriting history, not just writing it again, but rewriting it, correcting it perhaps. So growing up in the Willamette Valley and later researching Calabi peoples, there were few hints from settler accounts that the Indians lived anywhere other than in the reservations. Many sources address the treaties and removal of the tribes to the reservations, but then our history ended. Alternate history shows that Native people, even if they had homes on the reservations, had roles to play off reservation as laborers or symbols of American Indian spirit as they adapted to American society. History shows that many Native individuals accepted in their own terms the changing culture, learned to survive and adapt well while also finding ways to continue their culture and heritage. Many of these people, however, were exploited in some fashion for their labor due to their lack of citizenship and therefore lack of protections and rights in society. So even though the tribe, signing your land away and writing treaties, the government did not give you citizenship. You were still considered a member of your tribe. Even the promises of Ulysses S. Grant that if they showed that they were civilized, they would get citizenship, didn't happen. It wasn't until 1924 that Native people actually got citizenship under one law. So, and even then, it was not equality because there were still problems with, in Oregon, for example, there were laws that said that Native people couldn't marry whites and they couldn't own alcohol or buy alcohol. So there was constantly equality related issues all throughout our history. It wasn't until like the 1970s with a bunch of bills that were written to help us out, help out our culture and stuff that we began to getting some equal rights. There was actually a Native American Religious Freedom Act written in the 1970s because we were not allowed to practice our religion without it being attacked by the federal government on reservations. So lots of problems. So this is not necessarily an old issue. This is a very recent issue for many of us. So that's the end of kind of my presentation about the book itself. And I'm going to move on to my other research. So, like I said, I've been working more on environmental histories, environmental studies, trying to figure out how the valley has been colonized and changed by settlers. Because the original valley, as people kind of suspect, was what they call stewarded by the tribes, setting fires to it and much of the food then in the valley, the wild foods, was stewarded by the tribes. The fires helped that along. So let me just get into this a little bit. So here's our original sort of seasonal round for how we sort of moved around the valley in the summertime, spring, summer, winter, fall. And on all these camps were different locations throughout the valley. People traveled sometimes 40, 60 miles away from their home, village, and would come back and bring a bunch of food with them. And so, and then there was times for when you had excess to take that up for trade to maybe the Columbia or sometimes over to the coastal tribes for trade. And so that was a thing as well. And so so by this activity and by other things like burning, like I have on here, fall prairie fires over here. Well, like burning and fire activity actually helped sort of the land revive itself, because it's really the most efficient way to get rid of excess dead vegetation and to help spur the growth of new vegetation, new food next year. So that's kind of my understanding coming into this. I've been doing quite a bit of ethnographic work, as you can imagine, and I was able to acquire these journals from parts of the Wilkes expedition from 1841. And Wilkes was, the leader of what's called the U.S. Exploring Expedition. He actually didn't go down past Salem in the valley when he was on the expedition. He went instead north on the Columbia. However, he sent a large contingent of scientists down south, and they eventually end up in Sacramento. But they, past Salem, they made all of these observations that for whatever reason don't end up in the Wilkes published journals. And so these first-person journal accounts are pretty interesting. Like this one right here, and this drawing is from the journals as well. But these statements here from George Emmons and James Dana address, how they were walking through a burnt landscape in August and September. And in August, they could see the smoke curling ahead of them, and ahead of them was south. So they were actually in the valley at the time when the valley was being burnt, and could see it burning ahead of them, which is pretty amazing. And so what a really funny story from this is they would camp at night. Oops, what happened? Sorry, I'm not sure what's happening. Somebody decided to change. So they would camp at night, and their horses they had didn't have any forage around because everything was burnt. So the horses would take off overnight and go into the thickets nearby, maybe sometimes several miles away, and would basically just disappear. And so when they wake up in the morning, there's no horses. So how do they move south? So they would begin walking, and they would send other folks like their scouts or other people out to get the horses. Time in the journals, it talks about, half a day to a full day to find those horses and bring them back to camp. And by that time, the camp has moved, another 10 miles south or whatever. So it took quite a while, August 11th to September 7th, to get through the valley. And in September, they're actually at the Long Tom. So I guess about half the valley is traversed in that time period, while they're trying to sort of get through the valley, and the horses are kind of taking off on them. Kind of funny, interesting. But at the same time, when they go through a number of rainstorms in the valley, and these are in the journal accounts, and then they come upon this huge swale that they call Lake Balamali. It's probably a name they got from their scouts that were probably native guides with them. That it was 80 feet in width and 3/4 of a mile in length, and about a foot deep. So these two accounts from Eld and Emmons, both the same day, suggest that it was absolutely this small lake of fresh water. So they're on a prairie, they're near the Long Tom, and you see this fresh water, just laying in a big swale across this prairie. And I was thinking, because I've been doing work on the environmental history, I'm like, I have never seen this kind of lake develop in the valleys, in my time period. We see some small swales and things, but nothing that big. So what's going on here? Maybe this is the original character of the land that we live in. And so I began doing some research on what happened, on how settlers began farming the valley and draining off wetlands. And let me move right to the research here. So I have lived in Salem most of my life, since like 1972, and kind of in Northeast Salem, just down the road from Lake LaBiche. And even when I was a teenager, I got a job weeding the onions in Lake LaBiche, and it's a big lake complex north of Salem, kind of in the Kaiser area now. It's actually quite near to Chemau Indian School, but this lake complex, in my lifetime, which is now 50 years in Oregon, it's never been a lake. There's no water there, except for maybe in the wintertime, there's some standing water. So I've always been sort of confused of why is it called Lake LaBiche if there's no water there. So I began doing the research, like for the first time for myself at least, and realizing that, hey, these are 1850 GLO maps, 53 GLO maps. I began putting the maps together to show how vast this lake actually was. And it was pretty vast. It extended from the Pudding River all the way almost to the Willamette. And, some 20 miles or so across the valley, if you look from tip to tip. And so it was huge. And all these yellow areas you see on my map here, it looks like there's swales that come off the end of the lake probably when it rains, and then the lake expands. And I found all these accounts in newspapers about how farmers that lived in the lake, and you can see their farmer plots around here. All these gray square areas are farmers' lands. They would be planting their vegetables as close to that lake as possible because they really wanted to get into the nice soils, these nice black peat soils that have lots and lots of nutrition that are really good for farming. Well, the problem is in the summer times in Oregon, it rains quite a bit. It can rain quite a bit. Nearly every day when I was like a kid, I used to say like it rains and it could rain any day in Oregon, and it sometimes did. And so though that lake would then expand when it rained into a larger swale, and it would drown out crops, and the farmers were complaining in the late 19th century. We were complaining about this, and then what they did to get rid of this is they attracted some speculators, land speculators from California, this Hayes brothers, to come here, and they bought 1,000 acres of land on the lake, what it was called worthless land. They spent their own money digging a trench with a ditch witch all the way from their land, the Lake Labiche, all the way to the Willamette River. And that ditch today is called Labiche Creek, and it goes right through the center of Kaiser. Then by 1918, they had built enough drain field that the whole lake was constantly drained, because there's so much moisture that comes through here from the pudding and from rain and from snow melt and everything else that it needs to constantly drain. So they put enough ditching in, drainage in, so that they were able to constantly drain off this land and make it dry, make it arid. That made it perfect for farming, and now it's probably one of the best areas in Oregon for farming. This nice black soil, plenty of nutrients, some of the best soil in the world for farming. And so they were able to create an area where that land became hugely valuable. Their 1,000 acres they then turned around and sold right away when the land value went right through the roof. They were able to make millions on that, and were able to invest in other properties, one of which is the northeast section of Salem, we now call Hayesville, hence the Hayes name. And the other brother took his money and he went up to Wapato Lake. He did the same process up there, and I'll talk about that in a second. But let me show you some pictures from Lake Labiche. Here is our onion fields from a couple of years ago. Usually it's Walla Walla onions, and you can see the nice black soils. And then here's the onions being harvested. And then I wrote an article about this, and a farmer who has 70 acres there, I put it in a conservation lake some 20 years ago, contacted me last winter, or 2 years ago now, and he said, hey, he's had his land conservation 20 years. He has some native plants coming back, and I should come look at this. Well, we went there and we found 4 different plots of Wapato growing back. And this is a native plant, major food plant for the Portland area and for down into parts of the Willamette Valley, that began growing back on its own. It had not been replanted again. So seeds or bulbs or whatever was in the seed bank, it was in the soil, started coming back again by him not plowing it every year. And the whole land is coming back. There's lots of other native plants too, but this is the most exciting to us because we didn't know altogether how much Wapato was in this land before. Very few records of Wapato here. But now where it's confirmed, we actually used to have quite a bit of Wapato here. And here's the land, the Wapato going into the spring, into the fall, sorry. It's ready to be harvested at that time in around September. And then the first shovelful, we got about 10 of these little bulbs, and these are very small, not big enough to really eat yet. I guess you can eat them, but you wouldn't. And then this last year went back again. I dug more. We found much bigger bulbs. These are more acceptable for eating. If you're cooking up like a potato, Wapato was called Indian potato back in the 19th century, and so it was a replacement for potatoes until farmers actually grew potatoes. But as you can see, you know, the soil has quite a bit of moisture in it. You only have to go down about a half a foot to find moisture in the soil, like standing water. So it's pretty nice. It's now the farmer has been digging through the drain fields and destroying them finally to the point where the water stays on his land longer and longer each year. So that other brother, like I said, the other Hayes brother went to the Wapto Lake up near Gaston, Oregon, outside of Hillsboro. And there was a lake complex up there that we've known about for some time called Wapto Lake. It's had to be a massive Wapto resource, sort of like what you see in the picture here. Probably not exactly that, but it may have been as big as this. Up in the left side, we see this picture of the reservation of the Tualatin people. The Tualatin in 1851 wanted this lake as their own forever, as their permanent reservation. That treaty never got ratified, so they didn't get it, but that's what they wanted. Up on the right side is what it looked like back in the 1850s. I put together again some GLO maps to figure out what it looked like back in the day. And again, off the back end side of this is a giant swale that goes down south in this picture. So newspaper accounts say the same thing. These people the farmers were putting up plots right next to the lake, and when it rained and when too much moisture came in the valley, it would expand and would drown out their crops, since they were upset at that. So the Hayes family up here did the same thing. They dig a trench to the north into the creeks above them, and by 1935 they were able to drain off Wapto Lake as well. Incidentally, the lake actually hosted not just Wapto, but tens of thousands of these canvasback ducks were actually in the lake. Lots and lots of reports from newspapers and otherwise that say that ducks would come into the lake and they're flying, when they're flying and doing their seasonal flying, and would eat the Wapto there. They would stick around a while. And because of that, Portland sportsmen, these weekend warriors, would come with their guns, set up duck blinds around the lake, and shoot ducks in the lake every weekend. And then the farmers actually said, well, and they just leave the carcasses behind too. They don't collect the carcasses, and that creates a huge stink during the rest of the week. So it wasn't just the environment of the Waptos that was destroyed and all the other native plants. It was also all these ducks. So we don't, as far as I know, we don't see massive flights of these ducks anymore. These flocks of ducks don't exist anymore like this. We see Canadian geese, but we don't see canvasback ducks to the extent of what they described in the newspapers. So destroyed a massive resource. Nowadays, the federal government is trying to put the land back and recreate the lake again, but it's going to be some time before that's actually finished. So that is the process. And that whole process of draining off wetlands called worthless land was working in Oregon for like the last century. And nowadays it's quite common for farmers to put drain tiles under their land to constantly have this sort of drainage of water, because they need more arid soils to grow crops. And so more and more we have less and less water in the valley. It's constantly going straight to the rivers, out to the ocean, doesn't stick around in the valley at all anymore. So there's only a few areas in the valley that's a wetland area. There's some out West Eugene, but most of the valley is a dry, arid kind of wasteland for native plants and native animals. My own studies had to do with going to some parks around Salem. There's a park called Minton Brown Island Park. It's got some vast fields there with lots of camas and juncus. This is all juncus. The greenery is juncus here, and you see camas in the foreground and back here. The field has lots and lots of camas in it, and I've gone back there for 10 years checking out the camas, so I take pictures every year. I know exactly when it's ready, when it comes up, when it goes to seed. In 2002, we had some pretty good rainstorms in May. So we see what this field looks like. Lots of camas out here in it. Here's the path I walk on every time I go out there. Early May, it's dry. And then a couple of days later, we had a rainstorm. This is what happened. So I'm like, this reminds me of both, those ethnographic accounts from the Wilkes expedition, as well as, the newspaper accounts that talk about the swales forming after rainstorms. So this land doesn't have a drain field under it, probably. And so this water stuck around for a couple of days and then disappeared. But that's a swale. That's exactly what we're talking about here. And in lands that have not been overly developed, they can still happen. Incidentally, the camas and juncus from this area do fine. The native plants are actually adapted to water or part water in during their cycle. So juncus does fine, camas does fine. In fact, this is a couple days after that, and after the swale, and so we see a little bit of water on the path. That's about it. That's the last remaining. But this has to be had to have been a constant process through the summertime when it rains. Nowadays, we're in a little bit drier spell than when I was a kid. When I was a kid, it used to rain all the time. Nowadays, we're a lot drier in the summertime. But these I just recently went out to Wapta Lake and went out to this area right here, and there are swale areas out in Minter Brown and in Lake LaBiche right now, because it's been raining so much this winter time. So here's the camas when it comes up in the midsummer, kind of early June here. This is a giant camas variety that gets quite large, and we're about halfway through the cycle of the camas here, because you can see there's still plenty of blossoms to come for this piece right here in the foreground. It actually develops it flowers from the bottom and moves up the stem. So that's important to note. Now, I've been watching the camas because we're really in the process of relearning the cycle of the camas, so that we can reintegrate the knowledge into our culture again, because so much was taken away with colonization and removal and with assimilation efforts on the tribes. And then in late June, we have a more giant camas, the same area kind of, and we see this guy in the middle here. He's probably 5 feet or nearly 5 feet tall. So he's pretty tall. He's pretty big. And then the next time I took pictures, they had gone to seed and dried up. And so this is a really interesting period. And I'm now considering this early summer between April and June to be the camas season, because tribes would actually move around for the resource, not for what we call spring, summer, and fall. They would move for the resource itself. So that for the Calipuans, at least, this is their camas season, and this is the time when they would begin harvesting in the probably early July. So I'm going to skip through that. So let me show you one more thing. The oak savanna in the Willamette Valley. An excellent part of the valley. We have some pretty nice acreages out here by Basket Slough. This is the Smithfield Oaks area. So nice oak savannas. And this summer we tried a little experiment out there. It's a pretty expansive savanna, kind of restoration area in some ways. There's some ag out there, but it's actually being maintained for a waterfowl flyover area. Some pretty nice spreading oaks that are probably a good 200 years old or more. It's an oak woodland as well, and some of these oaks, while they appear small, because they are a woodland, they are going to be smaller. So I want to understand, when you cut these open, they're still very dense, and so they may grow slower because they have more competition, but they may be as old as the largest oaks too. Here we go. There's more and more. This is another dense oak woodland up on on Mount Pisgah. Pretty interesting. This is very dense. But this summer we started a fire and we were experimenting with fire in various areas. So we went out to Smithfield and we burnt little plots of on the land to see if not just the fire, but the smoke itself has an effect on the oaks. We think that smoke itself may cause oaks to respond with acorns. And so here us studying fires. We've done this a number of times, so it's pretty. We're doing it at the right time of the year. There's not a lot of thatch. We're controlled. It's a controlled burn, and we have the fire department here, so we're just trying it out. Here is going into night. Very controlled burn. So again, it's not just the fire, but the smoke itself. We're seeing if that has an effect on these oaks. In a year or two, they could mast really well. Could have a good crop of acorns really well. So, and then 2 months later, we went back to the same spot, and it's almost overgrown completely. You almost can't see. The grass grows back pretty readily. So it's interesting because we were pushing back a little bit against the people that say when the fire goes through, it destroys everything. That's not really the case at all. When the fire goes through, it momentarily can disrupt things, but if the land is prepared properly and has a regular burn, it doesn't destroy it. Simply what we call renews the land. So we ask a lot of questions. What are the challenges gathering food tribes? What were the cycles of stewardship? We want to understand more about the oaks and how they respond to fire, so we can understand more about our previous tribal cultures, so that we can begin to restore cultures today back to the way they originally were, at least with some of the original philosophical concepts and knowledge. There's another project I'm working on in the Cascades called in the Gibbs Creek area. There happens to be a pretty interesting oak and ponderosa landscape. It's a very odd landscape with not too much else but oaks and ponderosa pines. And as you can see, that this is an area that was utilized by the Klamath, Molalla, probably Kalapuya and Warm Springs people. So we're wondering if they helped, if some of these people who came through this area on trails that came through in the summertime, maybe were picking berries or gathering acorns up here, if they set the fires intentionally to spur growth of acorns, and that regular fire setting may have caused there to be only ponderosas and oaks that grew in this area, suppressing other trees, like firs and other pines, and even cedars, and because ponderosas have very, very thick bark, and oaks are very, very resistant to fire. So that's a pretty interesting thesis. By the way, ponderosas are also used as a food source. The inner bark is apparently very sweet in the spring. So this area is look at the Klamath area in the south and Oak Ridge on the north, and Jims Creek is right about there in the center. Incidentally, that's the direction where a Klamath Trail comes through in the valley too. The Klamath were actually pretty big tribes coming into the valley and hunting elk in the summertime, and then going back home, back to the Klamath country at the end of the summer. So I began to develop this seasonal round image, or at least a summer round image for the Klamath. Not something written into a lot of reports nowadays, because for whatever reason, anthropologists back in the day didn't realize they were coming into the valley, at least some bands of them. But some bands came in the valley hunting elks, and so what were they doing up in the Cascades? Well, they were getting ponderosas, they were getting berries, they were hunting elk, they were perhaps collecting acorns, and maybe they were setting fires to these fields as well up in the Cascades in the similar way that Kalapuyans are setting fire in the valley to spur growth, to eliminate perhaps excess vegetation, old dead vegetation, maybe even they thought they would control the ferocity of the burns in the future by setting fires, which is true. So we're just wondering, like, how much should Klamath only be for in their basin, or how much can we expand their range to? I think that their range, at least summer range, should be expanded up into the Cascades and maybe into the Willamette Valley in terms of their expansion. And that's all I have for right now. This is a picture at sunset at Minto Brown. It's pretty nice in the season when the thistles are up. So here we go, thistle flowers and stuff. So okay, so there we go. I think I hit an hour exactly here. So if people would like to ask questions, I see nothing really in chat, so maybe you just raise your hand. You know how to raise your hand? It's under the reaction button here. It says raise hand under reactions.
There's a question in chat. Can you talk a little more about the malaria epidemic of the mid-1800s?
Oh yeah. I mean, we don't know a ton about it. We have effects and stuff. There was probably, for the Calipuans, about 90% death. Other tribes maybe 75%. But it hit a wide region. And it caused, the collapse of many cultures. People had to sort of condense down to smaller villages, probably for protection than anything else. And but the thought is that fur traders and other sort of merchant marine that were maybe traveling in the tropics picked up malaria. They got infected by a mosquito there. As an infected person, they came up into the Willamette Valley, probably to Fort Vancouver, and were bitten by our own Anopheles mosquitoes here. And so those mosquitoes then picked up the malaria and then carried it to other people in the valley. It probably took a year or so for it to really take off, but there's been some thought that we don't have the right environment for the mosquitoes in the valley, but we do have an Anopheles mosquito population in the valley even today. So I don't know if that's exactly true. Plus, we do have, the wetland situation again has changed significantly. Nowadays, we have less wetlands. Wetland and standing water is a good place for mosquitoes to breed. And if we had a couple of years of really nice weather, really sort of warmer weather for the mosquitoes, they would have been very happy with that. They don't do as well on the coast, so we don't see as much malaria on the coast, but we do see that malaria on the Columbia, and in the Willamette Valley and north of the Columbia as well. So that's but so the vector would be the Anopheles mosquito, and the host would have been some probably merchant marine or fur trader that came through the tropics on some trading expedition with the Hudson's Bay Company or somebody like that. We don't exactly know who it is. There's nobody going to stand up and say, "Hey, I did it." But yeah.
Yeah, a couple people have their hands up. Robin?
Yeah. Do you think that white people were as affected by the malaria as the natives? They weren't used to it either.
I don't know. I mean, there was already a quinine was already a treatment. And from what I could tell, there's only one person that came into the valley that tried to give the tribes or show the tribes how to make quinine from dogwood. But I think was it Samuel Parker? I mean, I forget who it was, but there wasn't enough medicine to give all the trial people. So from what I could tell, they reserved the medicines they had for malaria for people in the fort and probably the white people in the fort. So, yeah. There's a question in chat about what do we do with oaks, with acorns? Yeah, there's a lot of research on this. Tribes in California and Oregon, Washington. I think most of the research is in California because they have such a big acorn crop there. I was going to get to the other question in a minute, but sorry. But yeah, so yeah, it's basically there's two ways you can go about it. Either grind it and then you have to sort of soak it in water to get rid of the tannins, or which are sort of poisons. Or around here they actually would put them in like a soft bag, and then they drop in the water like the local creek, let the water wash over the acorns for the shelled acorns for maybe a week or so. That leaches out the tannins again. Otherwise they're super bitter and they're kind of poisonous if you eat too many of them, the tannins, but that's why they leach it all out really well. Doesn't mean it's not going to be a little bit, bitter later, but it won't be as bad for you, it won't be as bitter. So they what they do is they grind it up into a powder and they cook it like a gruel, almost like a breakfast cereal kind of thing. So so it's much like cream of wheat, but it doesn't have a good flavor as cream of wheat. So it's a pretty major protein for California and Oregon. So yeah.
Gabriella.
Okay. Hi, David.
Hi.
My question, we talked about camas before. Those were such huge camas. And when we've gone out to harvest, there seems to be different varieties. Can you talk a bit about the varieties of camas?
The two that we have in our area are pretty much common camas and what they call giant camas. I don't think it necessarily affects the size of the bulb. I think the amount of time growing the camas growing affects the size of the bulb. As you get an older camas, I think upwards of between 8 and 10 years old, then the bulbs are pretty big. Otherwise, you're going to get small bulbs. I don't know if we've done enough studies of camas to really know exactly what difference is between giant camas and common camas, other than the size of the flowers are pretty big for giant camas.
Great, thanks. I really liked your presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there's a question in the chat again by Sarah.
How did I narrow down my research area? I haven't, so I guess I narrowed it down to Western Oregon. But I've spent time, sometimes months at a time, on different tribes. If you look at my blog site and you look at the dates on a lot of articles, you'll find me moving around from the Willamette Valley to the Umpqua Valley to the River Valley to the coast. Sometimes I'll spend a year on the coast looking at things. Right now I've been focusing on the Southern Willamette Valley because I did a bunch of research this summer in the Southern Willamette Valley, kind of ferreting out stories that were kind of missing in the record. And then I may have enough context now down in the Southern Valley. I can do another book on just the Southern Valley mixed with the environmental history as well. But there's, if you mean research like in what types of research, I use anything like anthropology, ethnography, folklore, history, journals, primary documents, manuscripts, letters, federal documents, sometimes legal stuff. Everything comes by that I hear about, I go look for and I find usually, and I use it as much as possible. Also, can you recommend some tribal or Indigenous research methodologies? I'm not sure what that means.
sorry. I was just wondering about if I'm trying to understand what it means too. I'm trying to find research methodologies that will help me to better understand Indigenous perspectives on also writing a historical kind of perspective for my dissertation. And so I am looking for, I mean, I read about a little bit about tribal critical race theory and of course traditional ecological knowledge. But I'm kind of still looking around for certain writers and ways, Indigenous points of view on how to do research in a respectful way, in a community-minded way.
Well, a friend of mine, Tom Ball, was doing his PhD when I was at U of O, and he went about asking permission of the tribe to do what he wanted to do. And so he got permission, and he actually had to get permission for it even to publish the dissertation too. Or he thought he did. I mean, clearly you don't have to, but he went all the way to the point of giving the tribe the right for approval or disapproval of what he was doing. You know, and I don't necessarily go that far, because in my perspective, I'm kind of at the leading edge of much of the historic research at my tribe. And I've gotten statements from both our tribal council and other folks at my tribe that what I'm doing is the right thing to do. And so I guess that's not a formal, like, proper way to do it, but I try to make sure that whatever I write, it's not going to sort of hurt anybody in the present day, which is kind of why I spend much of my time in the 19th century, because nothing there should hurt anybody really, or affect really anybody, except for the fact we don't know anything about it, and understanding more about it would be better. But I mean, it's all a matter of how much you want to work with the tribes and not. Sometimes tribes can be difficult to work with, and very slow in getting back to you. And then there's and the fact is, you know, as a Native person, a member of my tribe, I have just around the right to do the research as anybody at my tribe. So I don't necessarily feel like I need to get permission to do research on my own family. Frankly, you know, that's actually a family thing. I mean, now if it's somebody outside of the tribe that want to do research on my family, I may have a question or two with them and maybe ask them to sort of collaborate with me a little bit, or have me at least review the stuff before they release it. And that's kind of one of the things you can do, is say, well, I'm going to do this research, and then, but before I release it, I will make sure somebody at the tribe reads it and responds to it, reviews it and stuff. So that's another way to go about it. Some tribes don't have research protocols. I mean, like my tribe technically doesn't have a research protocol. They don't, their whole protocol is basically submit your idea to your project to the director of the cultural resources, and they may or may not respond to you. So that's not really a protocol. So and some tribes are very very protocol rich, like Siletz has protocols. They absolutely want you to work to go through them, especially if you're going to use data from the tribe itself. But I also, you know, there's some sensibility about making sure you don't publish where archaeological sites are, making sure you don't publish a ton about spirituality, because that's kind of a more personal thing. And I try also not to publish anything that's privileged for the tribe itself. They have it in their collections without permission. Like if they had a research document that nobody else has, I would make sure to get permission before I publish from it. But so everything I'm using is either published by the federal government or by anthropologists previously. It's already out there. It's not like it's not like I'm revealing new stuff. I'm just putting it together in a new way. That's all.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. There's also a book by Linda Smith. I don't know, you probably know her work. I mean, there's lots of considerations in there for the Indigenous researcher. The book is really, in my view, aimed at Indigenous peoples to really tell them how to do good research, or help them with that. And so I use that book quite a bit. So
I have a question with how have you been able to find much information about how the Kalapuyan people interacted with beaver before they got significantly trapped out, being as beaver are a large part of the wetland environment in the Willamette Valley?
yeah, we had this conversation among other scholars. I mean, I work with a team of scholars in various locations, various things. We had this conversation a couple months ago because there were questions about beaver and stuff. I think there are some folks that assume that all the wetlands are created by beavers. I think that's not necessarily true. I think it's the land itself is a giant wetland, and then the beavers help it along somewhat. But from what I understand, the attitude from the Kalapuyans was not to hunt beavers. Many tribes thought the beavers were more like people, and so they didn't want to hunt them. They respect them too much. They create stuff. They create the world, really, and so they're almost like a world changing animal creature. So they really respect them quite a bit. So Kalapuyans, from what I understand, did not participate in beaver hunting. That was almost purely a fur trader thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, any other questions before we wrap up here? Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Lewis, for this really interesting and educational presentation, and thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Thanks.